Hi, my name is Mariam. Today we're going to take a look at Chapter 3 of the 0470 History syllabus, which is Why Had International Peace Collapsed by 1939? So this chapter basically goes over the prelude to World War II and the various causes. So, what were the long-term consequences of the Paris Peace Treaties? And there were many. So the most significant of which was the Treaty of Versailles. And it led to the Germans essentially resenting the loss of territory and the demilitarization of the Rhineland. It also created very weak coalition governments in the Weimar Republic, which were unable to cope with the economic problems of the Great Depression. Moreover, the Treaty of Versailles created an international feeling that Germany had been treated too harshly, and this contributed to the disastrous policy of appeasement, which we'll take a closer look at. Extremists like Adolf Hitler were also able to capitalize off the German people's fears and humiliation. But aside from the Treaty of Versailles, Japan resented its failure to gain Manchuria during the Paris Peace Conference. Italy was also denied territory. It was denied the land promised to it in the Secret Treaty of London. Both countries would retaliate by becoming expansionist nations, seizing land in 1931 and 1935 to fuel their growing overseas empires. I guess you could say the most significant key player of the 1930s was Adolf Hitler. He was a German nationalist who had very popular plans that helped him in his rise to power in Germany. The most significant of which was to abolish the Treaty of Versailles. It had been signed by who he deemed the November criminals of the earlier Kaiser government, who had signed the unconditional peace deal in November of 1918, which most nationalistic Germans believed was a humiliation and no less than a stab in the back. It the treaty was what Hitler promised to reverse if he became the leader of Germany. It served as a constant reminder of Germany's humiliating defeat in World War One. But aside from that, he also wanted to expand German territory. He wanted to gain territory as well as take back the territory that had been lost after the war. He wanted for mostly unification with Austria, something called Anschluss. He also wanted German minorities in countries like Czechoslovakia to rejoin the fatherland. He Finally, he also wanted to carve out an empire in Eastern Europe to give Aryan Germans extra Lebensraum or living space. This would fulfill his ultimate dream of creating a Volksgemeinschaft or a blood community of pure Aryan Germans. And lastly, he wanted to defeat communism. He believed communism was the product of something called Jewish Bolshevism. And he tied this anti-Semitism to the German defeat in World War One. He believed that the Bolsheviks wanted to spread the Red Revolution into Germany. So he wanted to prevent that as much as possible. So why did the League of Nations fail? We covered the League of Nations in a previous video, but the League of Nations failed because it was weak. It had very weak strategies of peacekeeping. Sanctions did not work. It also had no unified army. It depended on the armies of its member nations, and the member nations weren't too keen on providing military support. And also, condemnation only went so far, right? Also, America, the strongest nation in the world, never joined. Britain and France, though very strong, did not have the same geopolitical power and resources to impose peace forcefully. The structure of the league had too many levels. Bureaucratic levels often clashed, and members could not agree, but decisions had to be unanimous for any work to be done. This in turn paralyzed decision making. The Great Depression also had a profound impact on the League's effectiveness. Countries replaced the international spirit of the 1920s with a beggar thy neighbor attitude towards diplomacy. They cared more about securing land and power than peacekeeping and cooperation. The League also had a very long track record of failures. The more the League failed, the less the people trusted it, so it became defunct as it lost respect time and time again. Its main members also let it down. Italy and Japan, which were permanent members of the League, left the League, and Britain and France betrayed the League, as we saw in the Hor-Laval scandal. And then lastly, in the 1930s, countries like Japan, Germany, and Italy embraced nationalism and defied the League. The Axis powers combined were too strong for the League to stop. So, Hitler's foreign policy would become a defining factor to the outbreak of war. He came into power in January of 1933, and one of his first steps was to draft millions of unemployed workers into the army. This would help reduce unemployment, deliver on his promise to make Germany great again, and it would directly challenge the hated Treaty of Versailles. Hitler knew that the Germans supported rearmament, but he was also cautious because he knew that if he acted too soon and too brash, it would alarm the international community into taking action. Thus, he began rearmament secretly while making a huge public display of his desire not to arm Germany. He then followed Japan's example by withdrawing from the League in October 1933. In 1935, Hitler held a huge military rally to celebrate the armed forces. By 1936, conscription had been introduced, with the Army, Navy, and Air Force being built up. You will remember that conscription was specifically banned in the Treaty of Versailles. All members of the German armed forces were also required to swear an oath of allegiance to Hitler personally. Hitler knew that step by step he could get away with violating the treaty more and more because many countries were also using rearmament to fight unemployment after the Great Depression. And the collapse of the League of Nations Disarmament Conference in 1934 was symbolic in showcasing that actually the League member nations were not prepared to disarm. They were not prepared to follow through with enforcing one of the League's main goals, which was to encourage disarmament. Rearmament boosted Nazi support abroad, with many British elites endorsing Hitler's regime. The British public sympathized with the German cause because they felt that the treaty's military limits were too tight. Number one, the permitted forces were not enough to defend Germany, so you could kind of view disarmament as a way of protecting one's country, and a strong Germany might be a buffer against the communism of the East. Communism was the number one enemy of the 1930s, so any way of preventing its spread it was seen as helpful. In 1934, Britain helped Germany dismantle the treaty's term through the Anglo-German Naval Treaty, which allowed Germany to build a navy up to 35% of the size of Britain's. This was symbolic in the continued violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, the Saar region of Germany had been run by the League since 1919. In 1935, the League fulfilled its earlier promise by holding a plebiscite for people to vote on whether the region would be returned to Germany. Hitler protested as many of his political opponents had fled to the Saar, but the League held firm. So he got his propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, to mount a massive campaign to persuade the Tsar people to vote to join the Reich. Around 90% voted to join Germany, and this was entirely legal under the Treaty of Versailles. After this was over, Hitler proclaimed that he had no further territorial demands to make of France, end quote. Remilitarization of the Rhineland. So according to the Treaty of Versailles, the Rhineland was to be demilitarized and occupied by the Allies for 15 years or longer. In 1935, Allied troops withdrew. On the 7th of March the following year, Germany officially denounced the Locarno Pacts and marched into the Rhineland. Amidst the Italian invasion of Abyssinia, Britain chose not to intervene and cause even more chaos. Reoccupying the Rhineland convinced Hitler that France and Britain were unlikely to act against further aggression. He would comment, "The 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of my life. Our forces were not strong enough even to put up a moderate resistance." Hitler's foreign policy, the Spanish Civil War. In 1936, a civil war broke out in Spain between supporters of the Republican government and the fascist rebels under General Franco. Hitler and Mussolini declared their support for General Franco, an authoritarian nationalist who shared their views. Britain and France refused to intervene, instead choosing to focus on their own countries. Mussolini sent thousands of troops he called volunteers, and Germany sent aircrafts and pilots who took part in the war's major campaigns, including civilian carpet bombing. The war was significant for two reasons. It, one, strengthened the bonds between Hitler and Mussolini that would later culminate in the Rome-Berlin Axis of 1939. It also encouraged Hitler to think no repercussions would come from Britain and France if he took no further action, if he took further action against the Treaty of Versailles. This encouraged him to violate it more and more. Militarism and the Axis. Japan was under the control of hardline nationalist commanders like General Tojo, who wanted to expand Japan's imperial empire across Asia to compete with the superpowers of the West. In 1937, the Japanese took their next big step by invading China, specifically Manchuria. Hitler and Mussolini saw that they had much in common with Japan's military dictatorship, having such a thing in their own countries. In 1936, Japan and Germany signed an anti-Comintern pact to oppose the spread of communism. Comintern was a USSR organization to promote the adoption of communism in other countries, and in 1937, Italy signed it too. This would lead to a new alliance called the Axis Alliance. Anschluss with Austria. Anschluss meant the unification of Germany and Austria, which had been specifically banned by the treaty. Hitler was Austrian-born. He was born in the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. He wanted to create a greater Germany that encompassed all the German-speaking peoples of Europe. And after his appointment as Chancellor of Germany, there was increasing Nazi agitation in Austria. The takeover of Austria came in after two attempts. In 1934, Chancellor of Austria Engelbert Dollfuss ordered attacks on the Austrian Socialist Party. From 1934, he ruled as a dictator, but by July, the Nazis had entered a radio station in Vienna and forced the staff to announce that Dollfuss had resigned. They subsequently entered the chancellery and killed Dollfuss. After the assassination, the Nazi murderers were arrested by Austrian armed forces, and Italian and Yugoslavian forces moved in to intervene. But between the next 4 years, Austrian and German relations soured. Mussolini informed the new chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, that Italy would no longer help them in the future, but would rather side with Hitler. On the 12th of February of 1938, Schuschnigg met Hitler, agreeing to appoint some Nazis to the Austrian ministry cabinet. On the 1st of March, Austrian Nazis began revolting in parts of Austria. By the 11th of that month, Hitler sent in an ultimatum demanding that Schuschnigg resign. German troops gathered at the border if he were to refuse. Schuschnigg acquiesced, and Seyss-Inquart became the new chancellor, and he became basically a Nazi puppet. On the 13th of March, Austria and Germany were formally united. And by April, an official plebiscite was held to give legitimacy to Hitler's actions. 99.75% of Austrians voted in favor of Anschluss. So, was the policy of appeasement justified? You could say, yeah, it was justified. For one, the fear of communism had a grip on all the countries of the West. It was the main worry of politicians in Britain and France. Many politicians saw Hitler as a potential buffer for communism because he too hated communism. So, yeah, also memories of the Great War. Both British and French leaders and their population remember the devastation of World War I, and they did not wish to enter a military confrontation with Germany again if they could help it. The British government also believed that its armed forces were not ready for military conflict. Britain only began rearmament in 1935. Intelligence suggested it was way behind. Moreover, Britain could not be sure of American support against Germany since the US had entered into a policy of isolationism and did not want to get involved with Europe anymore. Many public members also sympathized with the German cause. They believed that the Treaty of Versailles had been too harsh. Some people felt that Hitler's demands were not unreasonable. You could see it as a way of like self-defense, you know. And lastly, after the Great Depression, unemployment rose, And Britain and France had residual debts after World War One. So they didn't have necessarily the spending power to engage in military conflict with Germany. But you could also say no, the policy of appeasement was not justified, and in fact, it led to World War One, or World War Two, sorry. Because trusting Hitler, after each bold move, Hitler promised that his demands were met. And each and every time he broke his own promises, appeasement was based on the false presumption that Hitler could be trusted, that he would fulfill his own promises. And it proved that it became apparent too late that that was not the case. Also, Hitler spoke openly of taking Russian land. Appeasement showed the USSR, Britain, and France would not prevent him from invasion, and he would actually invade the Soviet Union in the 1940s. Hitler had seen time and time again of how his right-wing allied dictatorships in Japan and Italy got away with acts of aggression. He too was emboldened to act more and more radical. And lastly, the West was unable to take a stand at the end of the day. Hitler was a gambler who took increasing risks. At some point, Britain and France needed to unite and stand up to him to prevent bolder action, and they would, but it would be too late by that point. Lastly, the Sudetenland. This was the culmination of Hitler's foreign policy of the 1930s. So Edvard Beneš, Czechoslovakia leader, realized that Czechoslovakia would be next on Hitler's dinner plate. It was obvious that Britain and France were not prepared to stand up to Hitler. Nevertheless, he sought guarantees from the French and British to honor their commitment to defending Czechoslovakia from Germany. The French were bound by a treaty and said that they would, and Britain felt obliged to support France. However, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain asked Hitler if he had designs for Czechoslovakia and felt falsely reassured by his promise of no. Czechoslovakia was a new state that was formed by the 1919 to 1923 peace treaties and contained a large number of German-speaking people in the Sudetenland area. Thus, Hitler wanted it as Lebensraum for his German Reich. Konrad Heinlein, leader of the Nazis in the Sudetenland, demanded that they join Germany and create a greater Germany. In 1938, Hitler made it known that he was ready to fight for Czechoslovakia if necessary. The Czechs had a modern army, and Beneš was ready to fight. The Sudetenland had valuable forts, railways, and industries that would cripple Czechoslovakia if taken away. The Munich Agreement. British PM Neville Chamberlain met with Hitler one final time. At the meeting, Hitler moderated his demands. He was only interested in parts of the Sudetenland, the ones with a German majority. And then only if a plebiscite showed that the Sudetenland Germans wanted to join Germany would he act. Chamberlain saw this as reasonable. He thought if Hitler got what he wanted, he would be satiated. On the 22nd of September, Hitler said that he regretted that the previous arranged terms were not enough. He wanted all of Czechoslovakia, actually. And to justify his demands, he claimed that the Czech government under Edvard Beneš was mistreating the Germans and that he needed to rescue them by October. Chamberlain refused. With Mussolini's help, a final meeting was held at Munich on September 29. They agreed to give Hitler the Sudetenland without consulting the Czechs or the USSR. The next morning, Chamberlain and Hitler signed an agreement that they would never go to war again. This would be very symbolic and ironic. The Nazi-Soviet Pact was signed on the 23rd of August, 1939. On the face, it appeared to be a simple non-aggression pact, but Stalin and Hitler had been bitter enemies. This was the prelude to something dramatic. There were a number of secret clauses that were not made public. For example, the USSR agreed not to interfere when Germany attacked Poland and would allow Hitler a free hand in Western Europe. In return, Germany would allow the USSR to take over the Baltic states and Finland. Thus, it was not a treaty of friendship. It was a calculated agreement between two countries that were similar in their goal for conquest. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany finally invaded Poland, and 2 days later, Britain and France declared total war. So yeah, this is basically a revision of the third chapter.